November 23rd, 1943. Tarawa Atoll. The sand had turned to glass in places where the naval bombardment struck. Lieutenant Imamura Keiji pressed his cheek against the coral parapet of his foxhole and felt the earth shake with each incoming shell. The 127mm rounds from the American destroyers made a sound he would never forget. Not a whistle, not a roar, but something between a scream and the tearing of fabric, as if the sky itself were being ripped apart. He was 24 years old. He had been on Betio for 6 months. He had 3 days left to live as the man he was. The propaganda posters were still vivid in his mind. He had seen them in the lecture hall in Yokosuka, before deployment. Americans bayoneting Chinese civilians. Americans setting fire to prisoners tied to posts. Americans laughing as they posed with severed heads. The instructors had been very clear. The enemy does not take prisoners, they said. The enemy does not show mercy. If you are captured, you will be tortured. You will be burned alive. You will beg for the death you should have found in battle. They showed photographs, grainy, horrible, convincing. They showed testimonies from soldiers who claimed to have witnessed atrocities in China. Remember this, the instructor had said, tapping the poster with his wooden pointer. This is what awaits you if you surrender. This is American mercy. Keiji had believed them. Why wouldn't he? They were officers. They had seen combat. They had no reason to lie. And so, like every man in his platoon, he carried a small dagger in his belt. Not for the enemy, but for himself. Better a clean death by his own hand than whatever hell the Americans had prepared. The third day of the battle arrived like a fever dream. The sky was white with smoke. The lagoon was choked with debris. Shattered landing craft, floating helmets, things he tried not to look at too closely. His platoon had been 37 men. Now there were 9. They held a network of bunkers and trenches near the airstrip, firing at shapes that moved through the smoke, conserving ammunition, drinking water that tasted like coral dust and blood. At 1400 hours, 2 o'clock in the afternoon, though time had ceased to have normal meaning, the shell found him. He never saw it coming. There was only a sensation of the world folding inward, a compression of space and sound, and then he was lying on his back staring at a sky that had turned the color of bone. His left leg felt wrong. Not painful yet, but wrong, as if it belonged to someone else. When he looked down, he saw why. The shrapnel had opened his thigh like a book, exposing muscle and bone in a way that seemed almost educational, as if his body were teaching him anatomy. His femur was broken. He could see the white edge of it through the red. Another piece of shrapnel, or perhaps a splinter from the coral parapet, had pierced his chest just below the collarbone. Each breath made a wet, sucking sound. The morphine in his aid kit was gone. He had used it on Corporal Tanaka 2 days ago. He pressed his hand against his chest and felt the blood pulsing between his fingers in rhythm with his heartbeat. The pain arrived slowly, building like a wave, and when it finally crashed over him, he understood why men screamed. By nightfall, he had stopped screaming. He lay in what remained of his foxhole, half buried in sand and coral fragments, watching the stars emerge through the smoke. He could hear the Americans moving through the fortifications, calling to each other in their strange, flat language. Flashlight beams swept across the ruins like searchlights. He heard the single crack of pistol shots, Japanese wounded being found and finished off, he assumed. Exactly as the propaganda had promised. He tried to reach his dagger. His right hand wouldn't obey. He tried again. His fingers brushed the handle, but couldn't grip. The blood loss was making him weak. He could feel consciousness slipping away in stages, like descending a staircase in the dark. The footsteps came closer. 2 sets, boots crunching on coral. A flashlight beam found his face, and he closed his eyes. waiting for the bullet. This was how it ended then. This was the hell they had warned him about. Medic. He's still breathing. The voice was young, urgent, American. Keiji opened his eyes. Two Marines stood over him. One held a rifle, the muzzle pointed at his chest. The other was shouting, waving frantically. The one with the rifle kept the beam steady on his face. A bright, pitiless circle that turned his vision white. He tried again to reach the dagger. If he could just... Jesus Christ, look at his leg. Don't move, buddy. Don't fucking move. He understood almost nothing. His English lessons in the military academy had covered vocabulary for navigation and basic commands, not whatever language these men were speaking. Fast, clipped, full of words that blurred together. But he understood the rifle. He understood the light in his eyes. He understood that this was the moment before the execution. The corpsman arrived at a run, sliding down into the foxhole in a scatter of sand. He wore a helmet with a red cross painted on it. He knelt beside Keiji and immediately began working on his leg, hands moving quickly, professionally, without hesitation. Keiji felt a burning pain as the man wrapped something around his thigh and pulled it impossibly tight. A tourniquet. But why? Why waste supplies on a prisoner they were about to kill? The corpsman said something to the Marine with the rifle. The Marine shook his head. The corpsman said something else, louder, more insistent. Keiji caught fragments. Hey, still alive. Tag him. Let's go. And then he felt the needle slide into his arm. Not a knife, not a bayonet, but something sharp and clean that brought a chemical warmth spreading through his veins. Morphine. They were giving him morphine. American morphine, which they should be saving for their own wounded, was now flowing through his Japanese veins, turning the pain into something distant and manageable, a problem that belonged to someone else. The Marine with the rifle finally lowered it. He said something that sounded almost apologetic. The corpsman was already moving to the chest wound, hands steady, eyes focused. He packed the hole with gauze, sealed it with tape, worked with the kind of calm efficiency that suggested he had done this 100 times before. Keiji watched his own blood darken the American's hands and felt a cognitive dissonance so profound it bordered on hallucination. This was wrong. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. Where was the torture? Where was the gasoline and the matches? Where was the hell he had been promised? They lifted him onto a stretcher. Two more Marines appearing from nowhere, grunting with the effort, treating him with the same rough care they might show their own wounded. One of them adjusted the tourniquet, checking the tightness. Another draped a blanket over his chest. They carried him through the ruins of the fortifications, past dead men from both sides, past burning vehicles, past scenes of devastation that the morphine wrapped in a dreamlike gauze. The field hospital was a large tent near the beach, lit from within like a lantern. They carried him inside, and the light was harsh and white and absolutely clean. Surgical lamps, metal tables, the smell of disinfectant cutting through the smoke and blood and coral dust. A doctor in blood-stained fatigues looked down at him. An older man, maybe 45, with graying temples and the kind of face that suggested he had seen too much and learned to accept it. The doctor spoke to a nurse. The nurse nodded and began cutting away Keiji's uniform with surgical scissors, precise, efficient movements that suggested his body was now a medical problem to be solved rather than an enemy to be destroyed. Someone placed an oxygen mask over his face. The air was pure and cold and tasted like nothing he had ever breathed. The doctor looked at him directly. His eyes were gray. When he spoke, his voice was level, professional, utterly devoid of hatred or anger, or anything except medical concentration. He's an officer. Fix him up. A prisoner is always worth more alive. The words were in English, but Keiji understood the tone, if not the content. And then he understood nothing at all because the anesthesia took him down into darkness, like a stone sinking in black water. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Voices speaking English, the hum of a generator, bright light filtering through canvas, the strange, clean smell of an American hospital, and pain, deep, bone-grinding pain in his leg, duller pain in his chest, but pain that suggested his body was still intact, still fighting, still alive. He opened his eyes. He was lying on a cot in a large tent. To his right, separated by only a narrow walkway, was an American Marine. Young, pale, with bandages wrapped around his torso and an IV drip running into his arm. The Marine's hand hung off the edge of his cot, fingers almost touching Keiji's sheet. To his left, another American, and another beyond that. He was in a ward with enemy soldiers. The men who had been trying to kill him 3 days ago were now his neighbors, breathing the same air, sharing the same space. And nobody seemed to think this was strange. A nurse moved down the row of cots. A woman, which was itself disorienting. She checked the American's IV, adjusted his blanket with a gentle, practiced motion. Then she turned to Keiji and performed exactly the same actions, the same efficiency, the same gentleness, the same routine care. She said something to him in English, something soft and probably meaningless, and moved on to the next patient. His leg was in a cast. He could feel the rigidity of it, the strange architecture of splints and plaster. His chest was heavily bandaged. When he breathed, there was no more sucking sound, just the normal rise and fall of air, entering and leaving his lungs. They had operated. They had performed surgery. They had saved his leg. The cognitive dissonance was total. Everything he had been taught, everything he had believed, was wrong. The Americans were supposed to be savages. They were supposed to kill prisoners. They were supposed to burn wounded men alive. Instead, they had given him morphine, performed surgery, placed him in a hospital bed next to their own wounded. Instead of hell, he had found something he had no words for, not mercy exactly, because that suggested condescension or pity. This was something else. This was simply what they did. This was protocol. This was normal. A week later, though the days blurred together in a morphine haze, they moved him to a hospital ship, the USS Solace. He lay in a bunk below deck, listening to the engines throb, feeling the gentle roll of the Pacific beneath him. American sailors walked past his bunk without giving him a second glance. He was tagged, catalogued, documented. He was a prisoner of war, and apparently that meant something to these people. It meant protection. It meant care. It meant a set of rules that even the enemy had to follow. They transferred him to the mainland, California, San Diego. The ship docked on a bright morning in early December, and when they carried him up on deck, he saw America for the first time. Skyscrapers, rising in the distance, ships in the harbor, cars moving along distant roads. The scale of it was staggering. The wealth, the abundance, the sheer overwhelming evidence of industrial capacity. How had they ever thought they could win? On the pier, a chaplain approached him. The man wore glasses and carried a small book. He spoke in broken, heavily accented Japanese, clearly learned recently, probably specifically for dealing with prisoners like him. "You are now under our protection," the chaplain said. Each word was careful, deliberate. "The war is with the army, not with you personally." It was the first Japanese Keiji had heard in 2 weeks. He wanted to weep. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to ask how this was possible, how these people could separate the soldier from the nation, the warrior from the war. Instead, he nodded. The chaplain smiled, a small, genuine smile, and moved on to the next stretcher. The POW camp was in the desert outside San Diego. Low buildings surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers at the corners. but nothing like the brutal forced labor camps he had heard about from the propaganda lectures. The barracks were clean, there were latrines, there was running water, and there was food. The first meal was a revelation. They lined up, Japanese prisoners mixed with Italian and German POWs, and received trays from American soldiers who worked the kitchen. White bread, roasted chicken, green beans, fresh oranges, coffee. More food than Keiji had seen in a single meal since before the war began. He stared at his tray, convinced this was some kind of trick, some final cruelty before the real punishment began. A German prisoner sitting across from him noticed his hesitation and laughed. "Eat," the man said in broken Japanese. "They feed us like this every day, sometimes twice." He took a massive bite of bread. "The Americans have so much food they don't know what to do with it. Even their prisoners eat better than most of their enemies." Keiji ate slowly, carefully, tasting each item separately. The bread was soft and white and tasted faintly sweet. The chicken was real meat, not the dried fish and rice balls he had lived on for months. The orange was perfect, bright, impossibly fresh. He ate everything on his tray, and then sat in stunned silence while his body tried to process the sudden abundance. The guard distributing seconds noticed his empty tray and said something in English. When Keiji didn't respond, the guard simply placed another piece of chicken on his plate and moved on. No ceremony, no mockery, just food. That night, lying in his bunk in the barracks, listening to men from 3 different nations snoring around him, Keiji tried to reconcile what he had been taught with what he had experienced. The propaganda had been so specific, so detailed, so convincing. Americans torture prisoners. Americans kill the wounded. Americans show no mercy. Every single claim had been false. Not just exaggerated, completely, deliberately false, which meant what? That his officers had lied, that the entire military command had lied, or that they genuinely believed their own propaganda, that they had created an image of the enemy, so monstrous it justified any action, any sacrifice, any atrocity committed in return. He thought about the Marine, whose hand had hung down from the neighboring cot in the field hospital. That hand could have been wrapped around a rifle. Instead, it had simply hung there, limp, injured, human. And the nurse had treated them both the same way. The same routine, the same care, the same gentle adjustment of blankets. As if the color of their uniform mattered less than the fact that they were both wounded men who needed help. 2 months into his captivity, an American officer came to the camp, looking for translators. Keiji's English was rudimentary but functional, enough to read basic technical manuals, enough to communicate simple ideas. They tested him, approved him, and moved him to a separate section of the camp where prisoners worked on translation projects, Japanese military documents, training manuals, propaganda materials. It was in this new section that he found the library. A small room, really, with shelves of books donated by the Red Cross and various Christian organizations. There was a Japanese Bible, a few technical reference books, even a pre-revolutionary Russian novel, Tolstoy, that the chaplain had apparently contributed from his personal collection. Keiji read everything. He had been a mediocre student before the war, more interested in military training than literature. But now, with time and hunger and a desperate need to understand what had happened to him, he devoured books with an intensity that surprised him. The Bible confused him. All that talk of forgiveness and loving one's enemies seemed impossibly naive. But then again, wasn't that exactly what the Americans were doing? Wasn't feeding prisoners and operating on wounded enemies exactly the kind of irrational mercy the Bible described? One evening, an American officer gave a lecture in the camp's main hall about post-war plans for Japan. The officer spoke through a translator, explaining concepts like occupation and reconstruction and democracy. The words landed on Keiji's ears like blows. Occupation, the ultimate humiliation, the death of everything Japan had fought for. And yet, as the officer continued, describing plans for rebuilding infrastructure, establishing schools, reforming government, Keiji felt something unexpected. Not hope exactly, but perhaps its shadow, perhaps its possibility. That night, he wrote in his diary. He had been keeping notes sporadically, recording his experiences with the intention of, what? Publishing them after the war, showing them to his family. He didn't know, but the act of writing helped him think, helped him process the impossible thing that had happened to him. The entry read, "Propaganda taught us that America is hell and that we would become slaves. But here in captivity I was first given enough food and they saved a leg that my own people would have already written off. If this is hell, then our paradise on the islands was far more terrifying." He stared at those words for a long time, trying to decide if they were true or if he was simply rationalizing his own survival. Then he thought about Tarawa, the coral dust and blood, the men dying of thirst, the officers who ordered banzai charges that accomplished nothing except death, the constant hunger, the dysentery, the casual brutality of a military system that treated its own soldiers as expendable tools, the propaganda lectures that had prepared them for everything except survival. And he thought about the field hospital tent, the doctor with gray temples saying, "A prisoner is always worth more alive." The nurse straightening blankets with the same gentle motion for American and Japanese alike. The god distributing seconds of chicken without hesitation or hatred. The chaplain on the pier speaking careful Japanese, promising protection, drawing a distinction between the man and the war. Which world was hell? The one he had left or the one he had found? The war ended in August of 1945. Keiji was in the translation section when the news came through. Atomic bombs, 2 cities destroyed, unconditional surrender. The Emperor's radio broadcast, the first time his voice had ever been heard by common people, announcing that the unendurable must be endured. The Japanese prisoners gathered in the barracks, some weeping, some sitting in stunned silence. Keiji felt something like relief, not joy. The destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was too terrible for joy, but relief that it was over, that no more young men would die on islands whose names they couldn't pronounce, that no more families would receive the white boxes containing ashes and lies. An older prisoner, a lieutenant colonel who had been captured in the Philippines, stood up and addressed the group. "We have failed," he said quietly. "We have failed our emperor, our nation, our ancestors. Some of you may choose to end your lives honorably. I will not stop you, but I ask you to consider this. We are still alive. We still have value. Perhaps the most honorable thing we can do now is survive and help rebuild what we have destroyed." The words hung in the air. Several men nodded. Others looked away. Keiji thought about his dagger, the one he had tried to reach in the foxhole, the one they had taken from him when they stripped his uniform. He thought about how close he had come to using it, how certain he had been that death was preferable to capture. And he thought about everything that would have been lost if he had succeeded. Not just his life, but the knowledge he had gained, the understanding, the impossible education, in a different way of being human. He stood up. Men turned to look at him. He was young, junior in rank, nobody important. But he had been on Tarawa. He had seen the hell they all feared, and he had survived to find something else. "I was taught that Americans were demons," he said. His voice was steady. "I was shown photographs and testimonies. I was told exactly what would happen if I was captured. Torture, burning, death. I believed these things completely. And then I was wounded, and Americans saved my life. They operated on me. They gave me food. They treated me with more dignity than our own officers often showed. I do not say this to praise the enemy or to excuse our defeat. I say this because it is true. And if we are going to survive, if we are going to rebuild, we must learn to recognize truth, even when it contradicts everything we have been taught." Several men nodded. A few looked angry. The lieutenant colonel studied him with thoughtful eyes. "What is your name, Lieutenant?" "Imamura Keiji, sir. 24th Regiment." "I will remember that name," the colonel said. "You may be right. We shall see what kind of occupation awaits us." The repatriation process took months. There were interviews, medical examinations, documentation. The Americans wanted to make sure they understood what had happened, who had committed what atrocities, who could be trusted to return without causing trouble. Keiji was interviewed 3 times. Each time they asked him about Tarawa, about his experiences, about his observations. Each time he told the truth, the propaganda he had been taught, the shock of capture, the hospital, the food, the books, the slow unraveling of everything he had believed. The interrogator, a Japanese-American translator who spoke perfect Tokyo Japanese, listened carefully and took notes. At the end of the 3rd interview, he said something unexpected. "You know, Lieutenant, your story is not unique. We have hundreds of POWs telling us the same things, that they expected hell and found something else. The question is whether this changes anything, whether knowing the truth about American POW treatment makes any difference to how Japan conducts itself in the future." "I don't know," Keiji admitted. "I'm just a junior officer. I don't make policy." "No one is just anything," the translator said. "You are a witness. That matters. The men who lied to you about American treatment, the ones who showed you fake photographs and false testimonies, they need witnesses who can testify to the truth. Otherwise, the lies persist. Otherwise, the next war begins with the same lies." Keiji thought about this. "Will there be trials? For war criminals, yes. For propagandists," the translator shrugged. "That's above my pay grade. But I imagine there will be accountability. There has to be." In December of 1945, Keiji boarded a transport ship bound for Japan. He stood at the rail with hundreds of other repatriated POWs, watching the California coastline recede into the distance. His legs still ached where the femur had healed. His chest still showed the scar where the shrapnel had pierced him. But he was alive. He was whole. He was returning to a country that no longer existed, to rebuild something that had not yet been imagined. The man next to him at the rail, a former sergeant from Okinawa, said quietly, "I don't know what we're going back to. I don't know if our families will understand what we've seen. I don't know if they'll believe us about how we were treated." "They won't," Keiji said. "Not at first. The propaganda was too thorough, too convincing. But eventually, maybe, the truth will matter more than the lies." "Maybe," the sergeant said. He looked at the receding coastline. "Or maybe we're just a few thousand men with stories nobody wants to hear." Keiji thought about the chaplain on the pier, the nurse in the hospital tent, the guard distributing chicken without hesitation. He thought about the doctor saying, "A prisoner is always worth more alive," as if human life had inherent value, independent of nationality or uniform. He thought about eating white bread and fresh oranges while Germany and Italy and Japan burned. He thought about the library with its donated books, the lectures about Reconstruction, the careful distinction between the man and the war. "They'll want to hear eventually," he said, "even if it takes years, even if it takes decades. Because the alternative is to keep lying, and I think we've had enough lies." The ship moved into deeper water. The coast disappeared. They were going home, these remnants of a defeated army, these men who had expected hell and found something infinitely more confusing, more challenging, more human. They were going home to explain the inexplicable, that the enemy had shown mercy, that propaganda had been a lie, that even in war, some basic human decency could persist if people chose to uphold it. Keiji touched the scar on his chest and felt the rhythm of his heartbeat, steady, regular, alive. American blood had flowed through his veins during the surgery. Blood from soldiers whose names he could still remember from the labels on the transfusion bags. Anderson, Murphy, Rodriguez. Their blood had kept him alive, long enough for his own blood to regenerate. Their blood was still in him, would always be in him. A permanent testament to the idea that human beings were more similar than different, that wounds and healing were universal, that the categories of friend and enemy were less fundamental than the category of human. The ship sailed west, toward the ruins of empire, toward occupation and reconstruction, toward an uncertain future built on the ashes of certainty. And Keiji, standing at the rail with his scarred leg and his impossible memories, wondered if truth could be as contagious as lies. If mercy could spread the way hatred had spread, if one man's experience of unexpected humanity could ripple outward into something larger, something that might eventually matter. He didn't know, but he was alive to wonder. And that perhaps was enough.